It was 9:42 on a Tuesday morning when Daniel Thompson collapsed in his office from a massive heart attack. His assistant called 911, but he was gone before the ambulance even arrived. He was 56 years old. The hospital called me first because I was listed as his emergency contact and healthcare proxy. His wife Margaret found out 20 minutes later when the hospital couldn't reach me and called the secondary number. By noon, Margaret was already on the phone with funeral homes planning an elaborate wake. By Wednesday afternoon, she'd hired caterers and started a guest list. By Thursday evening, she was sending out invitations to what she called a discreet memorial service. But there was a problem with Margaret's plans. Daniel's body wasn't at any funeral home. I'd already had him cremated exactly like he'd asked me to do 8 years ago when we'd first started dating, and he'd made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure his final wishes were honored no matter what anyone else wanted. I'm Caroline Fisher. I'm 42 years old, and I'd been Daniel Thompson's partner for 8 years when he died. Not girlfriend, not mistress. Partner. That's what he'd called me. We met in 2017 at a technology conference in Austin, Texas. I was working in software development for a startup. Daniel owned a chain of hardware stores across the Midwest, 12 locations, family business his grandfather had started. We'd gotten coffee after a panel discussion about small business digitization. We'd talked for 3 hours. He'd asked for my number. I'd given it to him. 3 weeks later, he'd flown to Seattle where I lived just to take me to dinner. That's when he'd told me he was married but separated, living in different parts of the house, hadn't been intimate with Margaret in years, staying together for appearances and because divorce would destroy the business financially. I'd heard that story before from other men. I'd almost walked away. But something about Daniel felt different. He didn't make promises about leaving. He didn't lie about his situation. He just said, "I'm 50, and I've wasted most of my life pretending to be happy. I'd like to stop pretending, at least with you." We'd built something real over 8 years. He'd visit Seattle once a month, sometimes twice. I'd visit Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he lived a few times a year, staying at hotels, meeting him for dinners in neighboring towns where nobody knew him. We'd talked every day, video calls, text messages, emails. He'd been the first person I'd call with good news or bad news. I'd been his. We'd traveled together, always to places far from Iowa, Oregon coast, Montana mountains, New Mexico desert, places where Daniel Thompson from Cedar Rapids wouldn't be recognized, and we could just be two people in love without the weight of his other life pressing down on us. He'd told me multiple times that Margaret knew about me, that they had an understanding, that she didn't care as long as he was discreet. I'd believed him for years. Turns out Margaret hadn't known. Or if she'd known, she'd pretended not to, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging their marriage was a performance. 8 years ago, right after we'd started dating, Daniel had flown to Seattle with a folder full of legal documents. He'd said, "I need you to do something for me." I'd asked what. He'd said, "I need you to be my healthcare proxy. I need you to be the person who makes medical decisions if I can't. I need you to be the person who handles my final arrangements." I'd asked why not Margaret. He'd said, "Because Margaret will do what looks good for the family business and the Thompson name. I need someone who'll do what I actually want." He'd handed me the papers. Advanced Healthcare Directive, Durable Power of Attorney for Healthcare, Final Disposition Authorization, all listing me, Caroline Fisher, as the person with legal authority to make decisions about Daniel's body and medical care if he was incapacitated or deceased. I'd asked, "What do you want?" He'd said, "Cremation. As soon as possible after death. No wake, no viewing, no elaborate funeral. Just cremation, and then scatter my ashes at Crystal Lake in northern Minnesota." I'd asked why Crystal Lake. He'd gotten quiet for a minute, then said, "Because that's where I was happiest." Before I became Daniel Thompson, hardware store owner, pillar of the Cedar Rapids community, Margaret's husband, there was a summer when I was 23, right after college, before the business, before marriage, before everything. I spent 3 months at Crystal Lake. I was free. I want to go back there. I'd signed the papers. We'd gotten them notarized. Daniel had filed copies with his attorney and with the hospital system in Cedar Rapids. Then, he'd put a copy in a safety deposit box that only I had access to. He'd said, "Someday, Margaret's going to try to do something different with my body. Something that looks good. When that happens, you pull out these papers and you do what I asked. Promise me." I'd promised. For 8 years, I'd kept those documents in a fireproof safe in my apartment. I'd hoped I'd never need them. Daniel was healthy. He exercised. He ate well. He had regular checkups. But Tuesday morning at 9:42, his heart had other plans. The hospital called me at 9:58. They said Daniel Thompson had suffered a massive heart attack and died. They said I was listed as his healthcare proxy, and they needed me to come to the hospital to handle paperwork and make decisions about his remains. I'd been in a meeting when the call came. I'd walked out, gotten in my car, and driven straight to the airport. I'd caught the first flight to Cedar Rapids. By 2:30 that afternoon, I was at the hospital signing papers and authorizing the transfer of Daniel's body to the crematorium. The funeral director had asked, "Does the family know?" I'd said, "I'm his designated representative for final arrangements." He'd shown me the legal documents. He'd said, "We're required to notify the next of kin." I'd said, "Notify them after the cremation is complete." He'd looked uncomfortable, but he'd agreed. By Wednesday evening, Daniel's body had been cremated. By Thursday morning, I had his ashes in a simple wooden urn. That's when Margaret found out. She'd been calling funeral homes trying to arrange viewing times and casket selections. The third funeral home she'd called had said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Daniel Thompson's remains were already released to his designated representative." Margaret had freaked out. She'd called me screaming. I'd been in my hotel room in Cedar Rapids when my phone rang. Margaret had said, "Where is my husband's body?" I'd said, "He's been cremated." She'd said, "You had no right." I'd said, "Actually, I did. I'm his healthcare proxy and final arrangements designee." She'd said, "You're his what?" I'd said, "He signed papers 8 years ago giving me legal authority to handle his medical decisions and final arrangements." She'd said, "That's impossible. He would have told me." I'd said, "Apparently not." She'd said, "I'm his wife." I'd said, "And I'm the person he trusted to honor his wishes." She'd hung up on me. 10 minutes later, she'd called back with her attorney on the line. The attorney, a man named Robert Westfield, had said, "Ms. Fisher, we're contesting your authority here. Margaret Thompson is the legal widow and should have been consulted before any decisions were made about her husband's remains." I'd said, "You can contest all you want, but the cremation is already done." He'd said, "We'll file a complaint with the funeral home and pursue legal action against you for mishandling of remains." I'd said, "Go ahead. I have copies of all the legal documents signed by Daniel in 2017. Notarized. Filed with his attorney in the hospital. Check with Daniel's attorney, James Morrison. He has copies." There'd been silence. Then Robert had said, "We'll be in touch." They'd hung up. An hour later, James Morrison, Daniel's attorney, had called me. He'd said, "Caroline, I just got a very angry call from Margaret and her lawyer. I confirmed that yes, Daniel did execute those documents in 2017. And yes, you have full legal authority. Margaret's threatening to sue, but she doesn't have a case. You did everything correctly." Margaret had tried to pivot. If she couldn't undo the cremation, she'd plan a memorial service and control the narrative. She'd sent out invitations for Saturday afternoon at the Thompson family estate, celebration of life for Daniel Edward Thompson. She'd hired caterers. She'd hired a pianist. She'd arranged flowers. She'd written an obituary that made Daniel sound like a saint and made their marriage sound like a fairy tale. She'd invited business associates, family friends, community leaders, everyone who mattered in Cedar Rapids society. What Margaret hadn't counted on was me showing up. With the urn. Saturday afternoon, I'd walked into the Thompson estate carrying Daniel's ashes in a simple wooden urn I'd bought at a craft store because Daniel had specifically said he didn't want anything fancy. Margaret had been greeting guests in the foyer, wearing a black designer dress and playing the role of devastated widow. She'd seen me walk in, and her face had gone white. She'd excused herself from the guests and walked over to me. She'd said quietly through clenched teeth, "What are you doing here?" I'd said, "Honoring Daniel's wishes." She'd said, "You need to leave. Now." I'd said, "I don't think so." She'd said, "This is a private memorial for family and friends. You're neither." I'd said, "I was Daniel's partner for 8 years. I'm exactly where I should be." The guest had started noticing. Whispers. Stares. Margaret's sister Patricia had walked over and said, "Margaret, who is this?" Margaret had said, "Nobody. She's leaving." I'd said, "I'm Caroline Fisher. I was Daniel's partner." Patricia had looked confused. She'd said, "Partner? In the business?" I'd said, "Partner in life. For 8 years. The room had gotten very quiet. One of Daniel's business associates, a man named Tom Henderson, had said, "I don't understand. Daniel was married." I'd lifted the urn slightly and said, "Daniel asked me to handle his final arrangements. This is him. I'm here to honor his wishes." Margaret had lost it. She'd said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You had an affair with my husband, and now you're trying to make this about you. You cremated him without my permission. You stole his body." I'd stayed calm. I'd said, "I didn't steal anything. Daniel signed legal documents 8 years ago, designating me as his healthcare proxy, and the person authorized to handle his final arrangements. Everything I did was legal, and exactly what he asked for." Margaret had said, "That's a lie. Daniel would never have done that." I'd pulled the folded documents from my purse. I'd said, "Here are the copies. Signed, notarized, filed with his attorney. Would you like to see them?" The room had erupted in whispers. Tom Henderson had said, "Margaret, is this true?" Margaret had said, "I have no idea what she's talking about." James Morrison, Daniel's attorney, had been at the memorial. He'd stepped forward and said, "I can confirm that the documents are authentic. Daniel executed them in 2017. Caroline Fisher is the legally designated person for healthcare decisions and final arrangements." Margaret had looked at James like he'd betrayed her. She'd said, "Why didn't you tell me?" James had said, "Attorney-client privilege. Daniel never instructed me to share that information with you." Patricia had said, "I don't understand. Why would Daniel do that? Why would he give that authority to a stranger instead of his wife?" I'd said, "I'm not a stranger. I was his partner. We were together for 8 years." Margaret's carefully constructed image had started crumbling. Another guest, a woman named Dorothy, who apparently went to church with Margaret, had said, "Margaret, did you know about this affair?" Margaret had said, "There was no affair. She's lying." I'd said, "I'm not lying, and I can prove it." I'd pulled out my phone. I'd shown photos. Me and Daniel in Montana. Me and Daniel on the Oregon coast. Me and Daniel in New Mexico. All time stamped over the past 8 years. I'd said, "We talked every day. He visited Seattle at least once a month." I have 8 years of text messages and emails. Daniel didn't hide me from his life. He hid his life with Margaret from me. Margaret had tried to grab my phone. I'd pulled it back. She'd said, "You're a liar and a homewrecker." I'd said, "I'm the person Daniel trusted with his final wishes. The person he loved. The person he wanted making decisions about his body. Not you." Margaret had said, "Get out of my house." I'd said, "I will. But first I'm going to tell everyone what Daniel wanted me to do with his ashes. Because that's why I'm here. To honor his wishes. And his wishes don't involve this performance you've staged." Margaret had said, "What are you talking about?" I'd addressed the room. I'd said, "Daniel left specific instructions about what to do with his ashes. He wanted to be scattered at Crystal Lake in northern Minnesota. That's where he wanted his final resting place. Not here in Cedar Rapids. Not in some family plot. Crystal Lake." Margaret had said, "That's ridiculous. Daniel has never even been to Crystal Lake." I'd said, "Yes, he has. The summer after college, before he took over the family business, before he married you, he spent 3 months at Crystal Lake. He told me it was the happiest time of his life, when he was free, before obligation and expectations trapped him in a life he didn't want." Tom Henderson had said, "I remember that summer. Daniel did go to Minnesota. He'd been accepted to grad school there. He was going to study environmental science or something. Then his dad had a stroke and he had to come back and run the business." I'd nodded. I'd said, "Exactly. He gave up what he wanted to do, what his family expected. He married the right woman, from the right family. He ran the family business. He played the part, but he never stopped remembering that summer when he was free, and he asked me to take him back there. That's what I'm going to do. Tomorrow morning, I'm driving to Crystal Lake, and I'm scattering his ashes there. Anyone who wants to come and actually honor Daniel's wishes is welcome to join me. Margaret had said, "You can't do that. He belongs here with his family." I'd said, according to legal documents he signed, he belongs exactly where he asked to be scattered, Crystal Lake. Margaret had started crying. Real tears this time, not performance tears. She'd said, "This is humiliating. Everyone's going to know he chose you over me." I'd felt a pang of sympathy, but I'd pushed it down. I'd said, "He chose honesty over pretense. He chose someone who knew the real him over someone who loved the image of him. That's not my fault. That's not your fault either. But it's the truth. And he deserves to have his truth honored, even if it's uncomfortable for everyone else." Patricia had said, "What was at Crystal Lake? Why was it so important?" I'd said, "That's between Daniel and me. But I'll tell you this much. Daniel spent that summer working at a lakeside cabin resort. He led hiking tours. He taught people about the ecosystem. He was outside every day doing work he loved with no pressure and no expectations. He met someone there. Someone who saw him as just Daniel, not Daniel Thompson of the Thompson hardware family. They had 3 months together. Then Daniel's dad had his stroke, and Daniel came back to Iowa, and that person stayed in Minnesota, and they never saw each other again. But Daniel never forgot. He said that summer taught him what it felt like to be truly himself. And he wanted to go back there, even if it was just as ashes." Tom Henderson had said, "Who was the person?" I'd said, "I don't know. Daniel never told me. He just said it was someone who mattered. Someone who showed him a different life was possible." The room had been silent. Finally, Dorothy had said, "Margaret, did you know any of this?" Margaret had shaken her head. She'd said, "He never told me anything about Minnesota except that his dad got sick and he had to come home." I'd said, "Because you represented the life he was supposed to live. The duty. The obligation. I represented the life he wanted but couldn't fully have. That's why he trusted me with this, because I understood him in ways you never could." One of Daniel's cousins, a younger guy named Ryan, had said, "So you're saying Daniel lived a lie for 30 years? I'd said, "I'm saying Daniel did what was expected of him while keeping one part of his life free. Was that fair to Margaret? No. Was that fair to me? No. But it's what he did. And now that he's gone, the least I can do is honor what he actually wanted, not what everyone thinks he should have wanted." Ryan had said, "That takes guts. Walking in here like this." I'd said, "Daniel had the guts to trust me with his final wishes. I owe him the courage to follow through." Margaret had composed herself. She'd said, "Fine. Go to Crystal Lake. Scatter his ashes. But don't expect any of us to be there. This family won't participate in your fantasy about who Daniel was." I'd said, "That's your choice, but I'm leaving at 7 a.m. tomorrow. The invitation stands for anyone who wants to know the truth about Daniel instead of the version that's convenient." I'd turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, I'd heard Margaret say to the guests, "I apologize for this disruption. She's clearly delusional and grieving in her own way. Please, let's continue celebrating Daniel's life as he truly lived it." But I'd also heard footsteps behind me. Ryan had followed me out. He'd said, "I'll come tomorrow. I'd like to see this place that meant so much to him." I'd nodded. I'd said, "Meet me at the Cedar Rapids Marriott at 7. That night, I'd gotten 3 more messages. Tom Henderson saying he'd come to Crystal Lake. Patricia saying she'd come too because she wanted to understand. And James Morrison, the attorney, saying he felt obligated to witness the fulfillment of Daniel's wishes since he'd been part of drafting the documents. Sunday morning at 7, 5 of us had loaded into 2 cars and driven north. 6 hours through Iowa and into Minnesota. The drive had been quiet at first. Then Patricia had started asking questions. She'd said, "How did this affair start?" I'd said, "It wasn't an affair in his mind. He and Margaret hadn't been intimate in years. They were roommates." Patricia had said, "Did Margaret know?" I'd said, "Daniel told me she did. That they had an understanding, but I don't think that was true. I think he told himself that because it was easier than admitting he was lying to everyone." Tom had said, I knew something was off. The last few years, Daniel seemed lighter, happier. I figured he'd just made peace with life. I'd said, he'd made peace with having 2 lives, one for show, one for himself. Tom had said, must have been exhausting. I'd said, I think it was. But he said being with me was the only time he felt real. That kept him going. Ryan had said, do you feel guilty for being the other woman? I'd thought about that. I'd said, sometimes, but mostly I feel sad. Sad that he couldn't have the life he wanted. Sad that Margaret spent 30 years married to someone who wasn't really there. Sad that we couldn't be public. But guilty? No. Daniel made his choices. I made mine. We both knew what we were doing. We'd arrived at Crystal Lake around 1 p.m. It was beautiful. Pine trees surrounding a clear blue lake. Mountains in the distance. Little cabins dotting the shoreline. The resort where Daniel had worked was still there. Updated but recognizable from photos he'd shown me. We'd parked and walked down to the water. I'd been carrying the urn. Patricia had said, do you know exactly where he wanted to be scattered? I'd said, he wanted to be scattered from the dock at the north end of the lake. That's where he used to sit in the evenings after work. I'd led them to the dock. It was old wood, weathered gray, extending about 30 feet into the water. We'd walked to the end. I'd opened the urn. I'd said, Daniel Thompson spent 3 months here when he was 23. He found freedom here. He found himself here. He asked me to bring him back. So here he is. I'd poured the ashes slowly into the water. They'd drifted on the surface for a moment before sinking and dispersing. I'd said, be free, Daniel. You earned it. We'd stood in silence for a few minutes. Then Ryan had said, thank you for doing this, for honoring what he really wanted. I'd said, it's what he asked me to do. It's the last thing I could do for him. On the drive back, Patricia had said, I owe you an apology. I judged you without knowing the whole story. I'd said, most people will judge me. I'm the mistress, the homewrecker. I get it. Patricia had said, but you're also the person who knew him best, who honored him. That counts for something. Tom had said, Margaret's going to have a hard time with this. Her whole identity was being Daniel's wife. Now everyone knows the marriage was empty. I'd said, I don't hate Margaret. I feel sorry for her. She lost 30 years to a man who was never fully present. That's tragic, but I can't fix that. All I can do is honor Daniel's wishes. That's what I did. Today, 6 months later, I'm still in Seattle. Still working in software development. Still living my life. Margaret filed a lawsuit against me for emotional distress and improper handling of remains. It was dismissed in 3 weeks. The judge said I'd followed all legal protocols and Daniel's explicit written wishes. Margaret sold the Thompson hardware chain 4 months ago. She moved to Arizona to be near her sister. I heard through James Morrison that she's doing better. Starting over somewhere, nobody knows her as Daniel Thompson's widow. I hope that's true. She deserves a fresh start as much as anyone. I think about Daniel every day. Not with regret, not with guilt, with gratitude. 8 years of loving someone fully, even if it was complicated and hidden and imperfect. 8 years of honest conversation and real connection. That matters. That's worth something. And in the end, I got to honor him. I got to take him back to Crystal Lake like he asked. I got to give him the freedom in death he never fully had in life. Margaret gave him a memorial service with catered food and important guests and a narrative about a perfect marriage. I gave him what he actually wanted. Peace, truth, freedom. The lake where he'd been happiest. That's love, not the performance of love, the real thing. And I'd do it all again, even knowing how it would end, because Daniel deserved someone who'd honor his truth, not protect everyone else's comfort. He chose me for that, and I didn't let him down.